Welcome back to our Building a Better Truck project. In this video series, we'll be recreating this dilapidated pickup truck into a clean, no-frills vehicle. Just a basic truck that can be put back on the road for many more years of service. Now, the main feature of this project will of course be repowering the truck with a diesel engine. However, before we can drop in the new engine, we have to get this truck looking a little bit more respectable. In today's video, we'll be experimenting with an alternative and extremely low-cost method to apply fresh paint to the truck. And what I'm talking about is we're going to be using one of these low-cost electric sprayers and see if it can really do a perfect paint job. So in theory, this electric sprayer can potentially eliminate the need for a compressor, high-pressure air lines, a secondary water trap, and an inline filter. Plus, it eliminates the actual spray gun, whether it's a conventional spray gun or a HVLP type. That's a ton of equipment that we're not going to be needing if this electric sprayer works as well as others have claimed. So just so we're all on the same page, I'm not a professional auto body tech, but I've painted many cars in the past, and I do know the right way to handle the equipment and mix the paints. So first of all, that allows me to have an opinion on how well the electric sprayer works, which is the main focus of today's video. Now, when it comes to the actual paint, well, it really pains me to do this, but we're going to be using Rustolium and Tractor Supply oil-based paint products. This stuff is cheap and easily accessible to the masses, but it's not ideal, as a lot of professionals already know. The good news is the choice of paint is not limited by the sprayer. You see, the El Cheapo sprayer that we're going to be using can spray premium paint products or the stuff you get at Tractor Supply. The sprayer is going to work the same as long as the paint is mixed correctly. Today, we're going to use the cheap paint, and I'll be able to point out the differences between a better quality acrylic enamel versus the budget-friendly oil-based paints. So as you can see, this truck needs a complete respray, which is a massive project. So the plan is to paint the truck in steps. Step 1 will be getting familiar with the equipment and finding out whether you actually have the patience and skills to do a job like this. So if you're considering doing something similar, the best way to get started is to pick something simple. Perhaps just focusing on one of the front fenders is where a beginner would probably start. That's pretty much my advice. You see, if you can refinish one fender, then you likely have the skills to move on to continue the project. If you can't achieve the results you were expecting, then, well, all you've ruined is one fender. We're going to be doing this truck in 5 steps. Step 1 is going to be the front clip. Step 2 is going to be the rocker panels. Step 3 is painting the cab of the truck. Step 4 is either replacing the doors or repairing the rust. I haven't decided yet. And step 5 will be painting the bed. Each one of these steps is pretty much a weekend project, which works out great for filming a YouTube video. Keep in mind, the stuff you see on YouTube can take a lot longer because of setting up cameras, editing, and all that stuff normal people don't have to deal with. Anyway, let's get started. The spray gun that we're going to be using for this project was sourced from Amazon, and it costed $37, which ain't bad. I'll put a link in the video description if you want one of these. Now, since this is a time-critical video series for YouTube, I actually had to purchase 2 of these just in case we had problems. Having a second unit on hand meant we could continue with the project without any delays if we had any problems. And the good news is, future Jimbo just told me that, at least for this video, the first sprayer worked flawlessly for everything we asked it to do, so that's good to know. Thanks, future Jimbo. Anyway, this box is packed full of stuff. Most of this junk isn't necessary, and all you're really going to need are a few of the things. This cup is made from a thick plastic, which is really nice. This sprayer body houses the electric turbo fan and pretty much nothing else. Anyway, this guy has a very powerful fan in it that provides the necessary air to atomize the paint. This is actually what eliminates the need for a compressor. This extension piece clips onto the main housing, and it's what draws the paint out of the cup and propels it onto the surface that you're painting. It's of course made of all plastic, but it does feel very heavy, so it's likely thick plastic. And it fits the main body like this. Pushing the trigger slightly will activate the turbo fan, and then pushing the trigger a little bit more will allow the paint to start flowing. It's very similar to a conventional gun. This gun does have a flow adjustment that's built into the trigger if you need something like that, or you can just go by feel. The atomizer thingy that's pre-installed in the gun has a 2mm orifice, which in my opinion is too big if the paint is reduced properly. So the atomizer should be replaced with the purplish colored thingy, which has a 1.8mm orifice. This kit comes with a few different size atomizers, and the 1.8mm is the smallest and it seems to work the best. The pattern direction is of course adjustable, and it will need to be adjusted depending on what direction you're shooting. I ended up leaving this guy adjusted like this throughout the video because the pattern seemed fine for any direction. It's a bit weird, but the way this thing put paint down, it didn't seem to matter too much. So this thing is more or less intended to shoot latex house paints, and it comes with some cleaning accessories that absolutely will not work with oil-based paints. If you shoot oil or acrylic paints through this gun, do not attempt to clean it with water. That'll make a huge mess. Anyway, with the gun plugged in, pulling the trigger slightly activates the turbofan, and pulling the trigger a little bit more allows the paint to start flowing. This guy here is the flow adjustment, and if you have experience with a conventional gun, this isn't really necessary, and you can just go by feel. Now, if you're new to the whole paint spraying thing, perhaps the last thing you want to do is load this gun up with paint and start shooting. And if you want to get a good feel for the tool, just load it up with water and practice. Water won't hurt the gun at all, and if you can, practice all you want. But before you put real paint in it, you have to make sure the water is completely evaporated from the gun. Water and oil do not mix, so no shortcuts here. So we're also going to be painting the frame of the truck along with the body panels. Now the frame's going to be painted satin black and the body panels will be a different color. Anyway, the first step is to get everything as clean as possible. The frame really doesn't matter too much. As long as the grease is blasted off, it should be good enough. Now, for the used body panels, I power washed them first, then I went back and used Barkeeper's Friend to get the old paint as clean as I could. The used body panels have many years of dirt on them, and Barkeeper's Friend will cut right through that stuff. Of course, you still have to follow up with even more power washing. You know, the cleaner these panels are, the better the paint's gonna stick. The hood also received the same treatment, and like I mentioned before, the purpose of this cleaning is to get the embedded dirt off the surface. You know, you can use any method you want, but don't settle for less than perfectly clean. Once the part's dried, then I knocked down the surface with these sanding blocks. The first was 120 grit, and then I went back with a 220 grit. These sanding blocks are available in bulk from your favorite website. In theory, I should finish with a 320 grit, but for this project, 220 is good enough. The truck only has to look respectable, and it's not a showpiece. Now in the areas where I cut through the paint and into the steel, I'll prime these areas with self-etching primer. This stuff only needs to be applied to the areas where bare steel is exposed. Now on the fender where the paint was a lot thicker, I used an electric DA that knocked the paint down around the larger chips. You know, this could have been done by hand, but the DA is so much faster. So the number one rule in prepping panels is, if you can feel it, you can see it. And what that means is, if you can feel an uneven surface, you'll be able to see the unevenness once the paint is applied. So, this ding in the fender is going to be very visible and it needs to be addressed. This fender is actually in really good shape, and it's pretty much the only thing that I'm going to take care of. Now, I'm not going to be too fussy and inspect every square inch of this fender, but if you want a perfect paint job, then you need to look at everything. Remember, if you can feel it, you can see it. This aftermarket replacement fender was knocked down with 220 grit and with a green Scotch-Brite. This fender has an EDM coating on it, and I don't want to cut through that surface and expose any bare steel if I don't have to. Now, the fender also has a slight ding right over here, and this will need to be taken care of with some body filler. So let's do that next. So the body filler I'm using is Evercoat, which is a step up from the Bondo brand. You know, on a cheapo paint job, Bondo is fine if that's all you can get. To mix the filler, I'll be doing that on a scrap piece of plastic. It's not good to mix filler on cardboard, and that should be avoided if possible. Since we only have 2 small dings, we don't need a lot of filler, and this should be more than enough. And then I can add the hardener. Oh, that's probably way too much, and adding too much hardener will cause the filler to set off a lot faster. If you've never played around with filler before, definitely mix up a throwaway batch just to get the feel for how long it takes to mix and apply the filler. But don't actually apply the filler to the surface you're working on. It's just a throwaway batch that you can play around with. Anyway, this way you can verify that you mixed it correctly and the filler does set off correctly. And now I can apply the filler. Don't overwork the filler. It's best to apply just a small amount, and if you have to, you can go back later and apply a little bit more. You know, this stuff is cheap, and if you have a scrap fender, perhaps you could practice on that first to work out your technique. So it's been about a half hour since we applied the filler, and it's pretty much ready to shape. Shaping the filler is a learned technique, and it takes a lot of practice. If you're a beginner, it may take a few attempts to get it right. Remember, the number one rule is if you can feel it, you can see it. So it's important to feather the edges and get the surface to a point where you can't feel where the filler was applied. Now, sometimes you can get it real close and then go back and use high build primer to give it that last touch. On this project, we're not too worried about perfection, and the truck only has to look respectable. Now, on the areas where I did expose the bare steel, I'll shoot some self-etching primer. Theory, this should be followed up with some high build primer and then sanded to perfection. But this will be fine. You know, there are about 1 billion YouTube videos available to watch if you want to learn how to do surface prep that's better than good enough. Auto body repair is an art, and it requires discipline in order to master it. But you gotta start somewhere, and the more shortcuts you take, the less perfect the results will be. Another way of looking at this is, you don't know what you don't know, and that means you're going to learn one way or another if you try. If your first attempt doesn't look the way you want it to, then go ahead and try again. The next time, take less shortcuts and watch more videos. Okay, now is the time we can shoot some questionable primer on all the panels that we've just prepped. As you can see, I've already made a mess mixing up this primer, and it's a good thing I put cardboard down first. So when it comes to mixing up the concoction of chemicals, I pretty much go by feel, and I don't necessarily use the ratio gauge on the side of the mixing container. My best guess is about 4 parts primer, 2 parts thinner, plus a shot of hardener, and that'll get you in the ballpark. If the primer shoots on real thick, immediately stop and add more thinner. Now when I mix this stuff up, I'm actually looking for the correct viscosity, and this comes with experience. But getting into the ballpark is easy, and then fine-tuning the mix is also easy. You know, if you go by the numbers on the side of the mixing cup, that's fine, but be prepared to tune the mix once you start shooting. You do this a few times and you can pretty much just eyeball it. Today's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so the primer wants to go on a little bit thinner than normal. Since we'll be using acetone as a thinner reducer, we'll be okay shooting this on the wet side. And it's about 5 o'clock in the evening, and the panels have been sitting in the shade for about an hour. You never want to shoot paint in direct sunlight or on a hot surface. Now I'll be wearing a full face respirator, and that means I ain't going to be wearing my glasses, so pretty much I'll be shooting this blind. It could be worse. And of course I'm also going to be wearing the proper gloves. You definitely don't want to get any of this paint on your skin. Since it's oil based, it doesn't wash off easily. The radiator support did have a lot of surface rust, and I did hit it with a wire brush to knock off anything that was loose. The Rustolium primer should work its magic on this piece, at least that's what I'm counting on. Alright, let's shoot some primer. Oh wow, this stuff is going on perfect. It looks like we got the mixture just right. As you can see, it's going on wet, which is what we want in this temperature range. The wetter the primer is, the less orange peel we'll get, and that means less surface prep for the paint. Well, as a primer gun, this gizmo worked perfect, and I couldn't be happier. Now keep in mind, we shot Rustolium primer, but the gun would have been just as capable shooting a better quality 2K primer. Very nice. Tomorrow will be the real test when we actually shoot the paint. So cleaning the gun is the next test. This gun doesn't come apart like a conventional gun, and cleaning it's going to be simple but less than desirable. And what that means is, all I can really do is use acetone to clean out the cup and then spray clear acetone through the gun until it shoots clean. This is pretty much as good as it gets. Let's check that atomizer thingy. Yeah, it's clean. Now I'll load the gun up with some fresh acetone for the final cleaning. So it's been about an hour since we got done shooting the primer, and the surface is tacky but more or less dry to the touch. This is what to expect if you used hardener. Now if we didn't use hardener, then the primer would be a lot tackier and it may take a lot longer to cure. Fast forward 20 hours, and the primer has cured to the point where we can safely shoot on some paint. Of course, it really helped putting these panels out in direct sunlight to bake for most of the day. But before we can slog around some questionable paint, we need to knock down the surface of the primer to get a smooth surface for the paint to adhere to. So the primer on both fenders went on wet and dried almost completely flat, which is really nice. For the fenders, all I really need to do is hit them with a Scotch-Brite pad. Now if the primer was a bit rough, then I would need to hit them with something like a 220 or a 320 grit sandpaper. So for the most part, the primer on the hood went on really nice, but not perfect. So to prep the hood, I'll go ahead and use the Scotch-Brite pad, plus I'll lightly block sand with 320. The hood's going to be a bit tricky because of the ridges, and I need to be real careful sanding around them. So I'll likely ditch the block sander and sand these ridges by hand. The amount of surface preparation that I am doing is the bare minimum to get the panels ready for paint. But notice, I am paying attention to the details. I'm not being too fussy about it, and that's because I've done this many times before, and I know what will pass for good enough and still look fine. The stage we're at right now is the most critical, and the more effort you put in now will result in a better quality paint job. So after the panels were completely sanded, I blew off the dust with an electric leaf blower, and now I can use a tack cloth to get any of the remaining dust off the surface. Since I really don't know how Rustolium primer will react to wax and grease remover, I'm skipping that step. And the tack cloth will be the final surface prep before the paint is applied. Okay, it's time for paint. Now, my big secret is we're going to be painting the truck white. Yep, white paint has the benefit of sort of concealing a lot of imperfections. You see, the darker the paint, the more work you have to do in order to correct any imperfections in the bodywork. White paint is very forgiving, and you can get away with less than ideal bodywork. And since our goal is to make this truck look respectable, this will help us cheat a little bit. You see, both of these trucks are the same age, and aside from the rusty rocker panels on the blue truck, they're pretty much in the same condition. You know, dings, scratches, and whatnot. Clearly, the white truck presents better, and that's because white will conceal many of the flaws that are very visible on the blue truck. So, in order to get the blue truck looking respectable, well, we're going to cheat and paint it white. For the paint, we're going to be using magic oil-based enamel from Tractor Supply along with the recommended hardener. Now, to reduce or thin the paint, we're going to be using acetone and not the recommended and expensive reducer that's called for when using magic paint products. This is the exact same setup we did with the primer, and it seemed to work out okay. I reckon we need to mix the paint, and this time I'm going to avoid making a mess. The Tractor Supply Magic Paint brand has a decent selection of colors that are available in the 1-gallon buckets. It's hard to say if this stuff is better or worse than Rustoleum. Now, Rustoleum definitely has a lot more colors, but most of the colors are offered in the 1-quart container, and it's more expensive to purchase it that way. You know, I've never used this paint before, and it'll be interesting to see how long it takes to cure. Mixing the correct amount of acetone with the paint is subjective, and I'm looking to thin this paint down to the viscosity of regular milk, plus or minus a little bit. It's tricky because acetone is a great reducer for this kind of paint, but you also have to factor in the ambient temperature. You know, it takes practice. By the time you mix your third or fourth batch, you'll be able to eyeball it and nail it every time. The hardener I'm using is also sold at Tractor Supply, and it's for the Magic paint line. It seemed to work fine with the Rustolium primer. This stuff is expensive, and this little container was $22. One container is going to be enough hardener for 1 gallon of paint. Alright, let's shoot some paint. So I'm going to do my first shot on the back side of the fender to make sure the paint is thin the way I want it. The paint seems fine, but the flow on the gun is too much if I pull the trigger in all the way. Now, the trigger is adjustable, but I prefer to regulate the flow by applying less trigger pressure. This is a preference, and some people may prefer to use the flow control adjustment. If you're just starting off, perhaps adjusting the trigger would be best, but if you have the coordination, you can pretty much operate the trigger like a throttle, and the flow control adjustment's not really necessary. You know, I'm probably giving a lot of bad advice and a lot of good advice. Basically, when it comes to using this type of paint gun, it's best to practice with water first and get a good feel for the gun. This is the very first time I'm using this type of spray gun, and I picked up on it right away. So it's an intuitive design that provides an alternative to using conventional equipment. Now, a conventional gun does have something called fan adjustment, which allows you to focus the spray pattern. This gun doesn't have that feature, and for most people that's not really a big deal. Although you can get some fan control by how much you pull on the trigger. It's a bit different, but I do like it. Another way of looking at the difference between the electric sprayer and a real paint gun is about the same as the difference between a car with a manual transmission and one with an automatic transmission. The manual transmission gives you a lot of control, whereas the automatic will get the car moving without much drama. Both will get you to your destination as long as it's not a 10-speed automatic made by General Motors. If that's the case, well, you're better off walking. Now, when it comes to laying on the paint, this gun will put it on with authority, so you want to keep in mind that the first coat should be the sticky coat and don't lay it on too thick. The acetone will evaporate quickly, and you can come back later in a few minutes and add more paint. Shooting with acetone on a hot day seems to be the best way to get the paint transferred from the gun to the panel. But, as a lot of professionals may know, acetone is not the same as enamel reducer, and it can be tricky to shoot with such a fast evaporating thinner. On the other hand, oil-based paints are not the same as acrylic enamels, and oil-based paints tend to dry slower. So the combination of oil paints with acetone seems to work pretty good, all things considered. So it's been about an hour since the paints had a chance to do whatever it had to do, and the finish actually looks pretty good. We did get a hitchhiker, and unfortunately there's nothing I can do for this guy. I'll pick him off with some tweezers, but chances are it's not going to end well. So the paint's definitely still tacky, and it's not ready to be handled, so I'm going to have to be careful moving these parts indoors for the evening. Now, the biggest difference between oils and acrylic enamels is you can't shoot the oil paint in one shot. You can only go so far, and then you have to stop and let the paint cure before you can finish with the top coat. You see, the oil paint wants to be cured to the point where it's safe to hit it with wet and dry sandpaper before you can safely shoot the last coat. If you disregard this warning, you're going to run the risk of having the paint lift off the surface while you're applying the top coat. So it's best to wait 24 to 48 hours between coats. Fast forward 20 hours, and the painted parts have been sitting in the sunlight all day. I reckon we could actually assemble these back onto the vehicle, or we can shoot a second coat of paint. The Tractor Supply paint with the hardener seems to only take 24 hours to cure to the point where the parts can be handled without any worries. Now keep in mind, this is oil-based paint and it's going to take a lot longer to be 100% cured. Anyway, the surface finish on these parts is very nice, and there's little to no orange peel. The paint went on wet and it dried slow enough to give a high gloss finish, which is exactly what we wanted. Unfortunately, it's only one coat and we have to shoot these parts again. But I'm in no rush, and I'm going to let these parts cure for another 24 hours, then I'll shoot the second coat. In the meantime, I'm going to mix up a batch of satin black paint and shoot the frame and a bunch of other parts. You know, when I said we were going to paint the front clip on this truck, I really did mean everything gets painted. So the paint I'm shooting is a custom blend, and we're using Magic Matte Black with about 30% Rustolium Gloss Black, and that should result in something like a satin black. Realistically, well, I think I added too much gloss black, and perhaps I only should have added 10% gloss. It really doesn't matter, and the good news is the Magic paint and the Rustolium paint do mix. Now, both being oil-based paints, well, that's not too surprising. Off camera, I went ahead and shot the second coat of white paint on the fenders and the hood, and at this point, the front clip of the truck is completely painted. This fender came out nearly perfect, but I do have some orange peel in this area. Now, orange peel refers to the surface of the paint, and in a way, the surface resembles the skin of an orange. So there's a number of things that can cause this, but most likely it was the result of the surface being warmer than expected and a thinner reducer evaporating too quickly. You know, shooting outdoors in the summer is extremely difficult, and this is a minor casualty. The remedy for something like this is to knock the surface down with some wet and dry sandpaper and just give it a buff. So it's not the end of the world, and if we wanted to, we can fix this once the paint fully cures. The surface on the hood actually came out perfect and we don't need to do anything. Now there was a ding or two that I missed, and the good news is it really won't show with this white paint. Now this fender came out perfect and it pretty much has a factory appearance. So thumbs up to the Rustoleum, I'm pretty much impressed with that. The black parts actually came out really nice, however the paint is slightly more glossier than I wanted, but hell, that's good enough for me. Other than a thorough cleaning, I did very little surface prep and the results are a lot better than I expected. These parts will make the engine bay look a lot nicer once we drop in the diesel engine. The frame on the truck is the same way. It's a bit glossy but perfectly acceptable, and we don't need to do anything else here. The focus of this video was actually the paint gun, but to be fair, I had to show that the panels were prepped and any shortcomings that we may have encountered could be blamed on the prep or the paint equipment. The good news is the prep was decent enough and the paint came out extremely good considering it was done outdoors with a non-calibrated reducer. So the spray gun definitely gets a thumbs up and I'll continue using this for the rest of the project. I took a lot of shortcuts and we still had an acceptable finish. But remember, I kinda wrote the book on good enough. And the only way to know for sure what works and what doesn't is experience. The El Cheapo paint sprayer works perfectly for a do-it-yourself paint job, and the only real flaw with the sprayer is I don't like how difficult it is to clean, which really isn't too bad. I think so far I've burned through half a gallon of acetone just to get the sprayer mostly clean, but not surgically clean. Apparently, mostly clean is good enough on a job like this, and that's fine with me. I put a link in the video description for the sprayer, and by the time you see this video, I may or may not be an Amazon affiliate. So if you do click on the link that I provide, well, I may earn a few cents if you actually purchase the sprayer, but if you don't, well, I'll survive somehow. If I break down the cost of the materials that were consumed to this point in the project, we're close to $120, and that includes the paint sprayer. And for that kind of money, we got a lot of stuff painted, so we're well on our way to making this truck look respectable again. Now, if Rustolium paint is not your thing, perhaps if you double that number, that would be around the cost if we had went with a single stage acrylic enamel with hardener plus 2K primer, and of course the correct enamel reducers for this weather. You know, I'm a little bit out of touch with prices, and that's just a quick estimate. Anyway, I bet a lot of you folks want to see how this truck looks when it's completely finished, and I do as well. So consider subscribing if you haven't done so already, and if you made it to this part in the video, please click on like. Of course, if you want to, you can also become a channel patron if you want to support our shenanigans. I truly appreciate all my patrons and subscribers. You folks are what put this channel on the map. We'll see you next time. Until then.